So, hi. Let's talk about process ontology and process philosophy, and worry a little bit about whether process ontologists are trying too hard to create a contrast between substance and process ontology, and therefore rejecting everything to do with substance, ending up with an ontology that might not be as appealing as it could be. But then again, also that if they accept certain aspects of the substance ontology, the worry is that you can't really distinguish between the more dynamic conceptions of substance from these accounts of process. Now, what is process philosophy? And it's not easy to describe it because there isn't an agreed on idea about process. On the one hand, process philosophy, like Joanna Seip does in the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on process philosophy, she characterizes it partly in terms of an opposition to some ideas, notably the idea that reality should be conceived of as an assembly of static individuals whose dynamic features are either taken to be mere appearances or ontologically secondary and derivative. And she insists that, or she says the process ontologists insist that the dynamic nature of being should be the primary focus of any comprehensive philosophical account of reality. Yeah. And this is often depicted as a contrast between substance and process ontology. The question now arises then, does a plausible account exist of the sense in which things, or the static things really are processes rather than substances? Okay. And the first problem, we started to talk about static individuals, okay, but it isn't exactly clear how exactly substance ontologists depict the world in terms of static individuals. I mean, there's and then of course whether the process ontologists are really saying there are these distinct things, the processes, and they should be considered as phenomena or fundamental phenomena in opposition to the things that we identify as things. And I think that's we shouldn't really be thinking about the contrast in those terms. So a process ontologist is not going to say that the race is more fundamental than the horse. The horse is, of course, fundamental, but the horse is a process. And they will agree that, yes, the horse is made up of atoms or smaller entities, and these entities will be more fundamental than the horse, but the smaller entities are also processes. And this goes all the way down to the elements of the standard model. Quarks would be example of an elementary particle, and the process ontologists say, yeah, that is a process, not a substance. So really, both substance and process ontologists are interested in the same kind of entities, not to be the continuance of this world. Yeah. And they just want to give different accounts of this. Now, what about the claim that substance ontologists think that the continuants are static individuals? Well, it depends on who we're talking about. I mean, there's a huge difference between Parmenides saying that everything is one. There's just one individual, and it, of course, doesn't change. All change in diversity are illusory. But that's a view that nobody really holds anymore, does it? And then we have the atomists, and they would say, yes, ultimately, if we divide the world into parts, you get finally to the fundamental level where you have to have simple and unchanging but extended solids, right? And they then don't change. They remain the same kind of solids throughout history. But the atoms aren't the kind of individuals that we might ordinarily think of in our ontologies. I mean, this cup isn't an atom. It's a composite of atoms. And as such, it can change. So the things that we talk about in the world, they can change according to the atomists. And the world as a whole can change, even though the fundamental constituents don't change. But they are, in a certain sense, theoretical entities. The atomists never saw an atom, did they? Right? But there is at least some element of static individuals there in the atomistic view. And now then we have Aristotle, who doesn't say that there are smallest fundamental indivisible things. He would say that everything is a unity of form and matter, and all the individuals of the world, they are able to change. That's a definition of a substance, is that they're able to change. So neither the world as a whole or the basic entities of this world are static and unchanging, right, entities. But there still can be said to be a difference between that kind of fairly dynamic conception of substance and process ontology. And the difference is approximately this, that even though, I mean, philosophers like Mark Sentis, he has argued that Aristotle is at least on his way of in a way depicting substances as continuously changing. But I think the way that the tradition is rendered to us, typically at least, substances are thought of as objects that, while they can change, the default position is that they don't. They remain the same unless something special happens. So if I take the cup and I drop it to the floor and it breaks, then it changes. Okay, so they can change, but change is not a feature that determines the kind of thing that it is really. Okay, and in that sense, they are derivative and secondary. And then the process ontologists, they will insist that no, everything actually is continuously changing, and in such a way that the change becomes a fundamental and defining feature of what kind of thing that they are. And as an example, we can take really any atom that we can think of, and the way that the sciences are describing these entities is a compound of interacting entities, and those interactions are dynamic, meaning that the object has to change continuously, and if it doesn't, it will cease to exist. Right? It only exists as long as the interactions produce, in a way, continuous and dynamic changes. That's the basic idea, and the idea here is that everything is like that, okay, in the process ontology. And the worry is really that we might be trying to define process too much as not substance, ending up rejecting everything associated with substance, and that might give us an ontology that isn't as appealing as we would like to think. Now, we're really here onto a question of why be a process ontologist. And I would say, in a sense, I am a process ontologist, even though I find the incompatibility between substance and process ontology not absolutely clear. Okay, and one of the motivations is of course what stated this opposition to a static conception of reality. Although the kind of static view that I would be especially opposed to isn't the atomistic or Aristotelian view, but a view that comes out of what I would like to call the modern analytic view of individual. It's which arguably depict reality in a static way. So this could be characterized as the epitome of the kind of ontology that process ontologists are opposed to. Okay. And this is a view of the individuals, the particulars of this world, not as Aristotelian unities of form and matter, but really only as the bearer of properties, okay? The bare particular, the thin particular. So it's something that has attributes, but isn't an attribute. But the modern view combines that conception also with the claim, very popular, to say that such particulars or individuals are individuated by their properties. That's how we tell them apart. And those two claims together give us really then the consequence, which we could associate to the Leibnizian conception of identity, notably that wherever there is qualitative difference, there is numeric distinctness, and vice versa. Right? And this fits very naturally to the way that we ordinarily think of objects, right? That objects are different. They almost like what constitutes a difference as individuals is because they're qualitatively different. And as long as we, just fix on the objects around us, that idea doesn't strike us as having any problems really at all. The problem only emerges if you start to think that this applies also in a way for a single object over time. Is an object identical to itself between times? Okay. And this becomes especially clear, the problem becomes clear if you assume also then eternalism, the idea that all times exist in parity. There isn't anything particular about the present. It's not how things really are, is not how things really are presently, but how they all are at all times. And now we have really spelled out explicit ontological commitments. That's the basis for David Lewis's problem of temporal intrinsics. And the problem can be illustrated using that argument, really, that if David Lewis at T1 and David Lewis at T2, 3, and 4, and 5, that he has different properties at these different times, different and incompatible properties, then it appears that we get a contradiction, that David Lewis has both F and not F. His own example is of David Lewis being bent and straight. So if he sits down at one point and he's bent and then he stands up and he's straight, should we say David Lewis is bent and straight? No, that can't be. So we apply this principle of wherever there's qualitative difference, there's numeric distinctness, and we are then compelled to accept that David Lewis isn't really a three-dimensional entity moving through time. He's really composed of different temporal parts. One part exists at a particular time being bent, another part exists at a particular point being straight. And that takes away the problem. But it leaves us with another problem, which is what kind of dynamic change and dynamism generally can there exist in such a world? This really gives us the idea of reality as a whole from beginning to end of time as this mosaic of local matters of fact, of point particles or property instances existing at certain space-time coordinates, bearing certain properties, but never moving about in space or in time and never losing and acquiring properties. Though the collective that they belong to might appear in an illusory way to change its properties. And the question now arises here, what kind of change can we have? Well, we can have variation over time. And that's variation is just difference between different temporal parts existing at different times. Some would say that's not change at all, that's just variation, which is of course a controversial issue. What kind of persistence can we have? Well, we can only have temporal compounds that exist at many times by having different parts existing at different times. And nothing, neither the whole or the parts in a way move really between times. And causation is here reduced to just regularities in the patterns of the instances existing at, property instances existing at different times. Nothing is exerts an influence on anything else, nothing is produced in this conception. So that would be an example of a typically static conception of reality. And the reason why I'm depicting this so clearly now is really that it spells out what the process ontology really has to avoid. Right? You can't end up in the same kind of problem with change and persistence as we get here. But ironically, some process accounts comes stumblingly close to end up in similar accounts of change and persistence and causation, which isn't what they should want. Now, why be a process ontologist? From the beginning, I think the reasons always have been empirical, really, that we observe the world and in our experience, everything appears to change. And in fact, the more we know about things, the more they appear to change. I mean, this cup here might not seem to change from day to day for us, but if we read a little bit of physics, we know that it's composed of molecules and atoms that are in continuous change, and if they weren't, the cup would disintegrate right in my hand. It's more obvious when we look at biological entities. We know that in our bodies something is happening continuously, and that keeps us alive. Right? If the cells would stop producing energy, we would die very quickly. But the idea has still been that if we take these complex entities like a body and then we divide it into its smallest components, we must end up with smallest indivisible symbols that don't change, right? The atom. The problem has still been that whenever we thought that we have to identify the atom, because this argument that we have to end up with atoms is an a priori argument. The idea is that it's conceptually impossible to think that everything divides infinitely, right? But whenever we thought we found some indivisible entity, it has turned out that they were actually not. They were compounds. The atom is made of electrons and protons and neutrons. And in fact, the neutrons and protons turn out to be made of further component parts. So now that we think the elements of the physics, right, are quarks and gluons composing a proton or a neutron. But they are, of course, only treated as, for the time being, elements, i.e. things we don't know whether they have an internal structure. But the important point, are they described as static and unchanging? And in fact, they're not. They're depicted as entities in continuous interaction with each other within the neutron, exchanging gluons. And as they do that, they change. So we don't end up empirically with a description of reality in terms of static individuals. Now, we're not, in a way, out to say that it's impossible that there are static individuals. I think the more reasonable question here is there a process ontology that makes sense of everything then as these dynamic entities, okay? The problem involved in describing or giving a process ontological account of that is best described initially by going through what used to be really the process philosophical view, the one and only one, notably the view of Whitehead and his followers, which I here call the stage view. And I'm borrowing here a characterization of this stage view from Nicholas Fresher. And it's not that these claims are typical perhaps of any particular philosopher. These are other claims that he says that process philosophers tend to agree with, okay? But we can use it to in a way, try and give us a coherent conception of a process. And according to this view, a process is a series of temporally ordered stages. And so far, we've not said anything that a substance ontologist who believes in processes would say. So Dorothy Emmett, for instance, insisted, processes are very real, and they are a series of temporal stages. It's just that the stages are changes in substances, right? So my intestines are digesting all the time. That's a process, but these are changes happening in me as a substance, or in the intestines as a substance, or whatever. So I have to say something more to create the contrast to substance ontology. And the second claim is that the stages involve becoming, a transition from potentiality to actuality. That's an idea that Whitehead described as concrescence. Really that, and that's why I've drawn first this series of stages as potentially colored, but they're not really colored, okay? And then each stage becomes actually colored, right, in succession, yeah? And in fact, so far, we've not managed to create the contrast to substance ontology, because an Aristotelian like Dorothy Emmett will say, whenever a substance changes, a potentiality that it has becomes actual, right? So there is a continuous concrescence going on in substances as they change. But it's really the third claim that creates a contrast, and that's why I really began with a series of distinct potentially colored stages, because the third claim is that the stages are distinct. And that's not what an Aristotelian could accept, because they would say that, no, the potentiality for the next stage resides in the object that has actually a certain instantiates, actually a certain nature. So really, the actuality of each stage has to come out of the previous stage directly. So it's really wrong on the Aristotelian view to begin with a series of potentialities, right? Because really, we never have pure potentialities. We only ever have objects with an actual nature. And so the actuality of the next has to really come out of the potentiality hiding behind the green figure, right? And the actuality of the next, okay, and so on. So we'd have to illustrate the Aristotelian view differently from what I've done here. Now, quick readers will have noticed that this is what creates problem with the later tradition claims, right? But let's go through the claims here. The fourth is that the process is homeomerous, and that means just that each stage is itself also a process, i.e. it has stages which concurrent, and each stage here also has stages that concurrent, etc. ad infinitum. And that's also designed in a way to create the contrast, i.e. no matter how much we divide a process, we'll never end up with a static individual, right? Only ever dynamic things. But we run into problems with infinite divisibility here as well, so on and so forth. Now, the fifth claim is that the stages are systematically linked, causally or functionally, and I will focus on the causal aspect. Those who talk about the functional connection are really only those that have accepted the Russellian critique of the concept of causation in the paper on the notion of cause. So let's talk about causation, right? What kind of causation can we fit into this image? And it seems difficult to fit this to an efficient causation conception, i.e. when something causes something else by exerting an influence on it. Because how can an actuality act on a pure potentiality? So if a billiard ball rolls across the table and hits another ball, it hits an actuality, right? There is a ball with an actual nature that it exerts an influence on. To hit a pure potentiality seems to be like hitting a ghost or hitting a ball that doesn't exist yet, but starts to exist as soon as you hit it. And that's a kind of weird conception of efficient causation. The kind of causal account that we could get is perhaps predetermined harmony, that whenever one stage in a way concrescents, the next will follow, right? Not because it actually exerts an influence on it, but because they're determined to do that. An alternative is that's often appealed to is to appeal to the concept of absolute becoming, that it's not really even coming into being out of a potentiality, but of nothing, right? The different stages just become. And really the claim ultimately will be that at each moment the world is recreated anew from nothing. And that's a mysterious kind of conception of causation that I don't want to spend time talking about here. I'll just point out that this is one of the perhaps less appealing options open for a process ontologist. The sixth claim is that the stages are generically linked, and that's stated as each stage originates from the previous stage. And that puzzles me. How can that be if they're distinct? And it puzzles me that Rescher doesn't realize the incompatibility, potential incompatibility at least, between the two stages here. Or the two claims. But the Aristotelian has no problem here. Each stage comes out of the previous stage because the potentiality for each new stage resides in the actual object that precedes it, right? But a process ontologist that want to stick to the kind of the stages are distinct can't appeal to that. I should specify that you could, of course, think of the stages as just temporally distinct, but that would also fit the Aristotelian view. And they can't be just qualitatively distinct because that could also fit the Aristotelian view. So to create a contrast to process view, or create a unique process ontological stage view, they have to be ontologically distinct. And that typically means that they're existentially distinct. They have to be independent existence, each stage. Ironically, perhaps, the attempt here to produce or introduce dynamicity into the world threatens to introduce similar kinds of problems as we saw with the modern analytic view, which is that change is really reduced to either just variation between stages. So you never have the case where an apple goes from green to red. It's only one stage moves from potentially green to actually green, and another stage moves from potentially red to actually red. But the apple never goes from green to red, except in the illusory sense that when we see different stages in succession, we think that it's the same, but it's not the same. Now, of course, in addition, it wouldn't be just variation between stages, because each stage would then have this dynamic change of transition from potentiality to actuality. They concrescent, they become. And a third option would be to say that they become out of nothing. That wouldn't really be concrescenting. That would be different kind of becoming, absolute becoming. But not identical problems with the modern analytic view of static individuals. And as I said, I'm not arguing that these are incoherent views, but rather pointing out this is the kind of dynamism that you get. Do you want it? There is also a problem with a generic link. Do we really want to postulate that everything comes into being out of nothing or out of some things that don't already exist? And do we want an account of causation that doesn't involve efficient causation, influence exerted on anything else? We have, in a way, a certain kind of regularity, even though it's regularity between becomings rather than just between property instances existing at different space-time coordinates. Now, the stage view is actually now a conception of process that most process ontologists today reject. So, and much because of the problems that you get here, mainly perhaps that they don't want to deny that there are what they call temporally stable and reliably recurrent aspects in a process. That's what they appear as things to us, perhaps. But the problem here is that the suggestions about what it is that constitute these temporally stable and reliably recurrent aspects, like Salmon's suggestion about processes carrying a mark, the idea that they are causal powers or invariant features, they are all on the side of the more kind of qualitative similarity, right? And might not be suitable to explain how things remain numerically the same through change. They just don't change qualitatively in terms of, let's say, the invariant feature. So again, I think we have a problem with saying really, what exactly is it that remains the same through the change that goes on? And ultimately, they end up really saying that, or offering us really a very intuitive idea about process and appealing to the empirical findings and descriptions, right? So they would say that a process is something for which change is essential, and then they, really whatever we can pick out, this cup, it appears not to change, but actually the atoms in it are continuously changing, and if they weren't, this would disintegrate. The atom is continuously changing. You just pick out your entities from the ontology of the empirical sciences, and you point out that changes, everything changes. But they don't really perhaps have a very clear model of how exactly to account for or explain in a more metaphysical sense what is it about these processes that remain the same through the change. And it's, of course, as soon as they say there is something that remains the same, you might not be saying too much different than an Aristotelian substance ontologist is saying. Something remains the same, right? They might say it's the matter, but that matter is really considered as something. It's not really something that we can describe in terms of having certain particular properties. It's just a conception of there is something that bears the properties and remains numerically the same through the changes. It's what is able to receive the contrast and so on, right? So the contrast here between substance and process ontologies diminish the more you get to the problems of saying what exactly is it that remains the same, and still they feel the need to say there has to be something that remains the same, right? To account, for instance, for the generic connection. And I'll end on this note of here we might have the problem to discuss about the nature of processes, fundamental nature of processes, and of course also have we been thinking wrong about the nature of substances, and would the ultimate description of things as dynamic entities, is it clear that they must end up as characterizations in terms of process rather than substance, or a little bit of both? And thank you for listening, and hope you have lots of questions, which I can, of course, answer here. Thank you.